Today we're going to look at a presentation called the celebrated drugs. And what this refers to is drugs that are very commonly used, easily accessible, and even promoted throughout American culture. Now the drugs we're going to look at are alcohol, caffeine, and marijuana. Most people probably won't be surprised that alcohol and caffeine are the first two on that list. They've been part of American society for many years, and many generations have grown up used to them being used. Even though there's restrictions on alcohol, it's very much embedded in American culture. Caffeine, the exact same thing. Very easily accessible and almost no restrictions on its use. The one that might surprise people is marijuana. Now in earlier generations, 20, 30 or more years ago, this drug probably would not have been on the list. Instead, what we would have seen is nicotine or cigarettes, which were much more commonly used and celebrated by previous generations. If you've never seen the TV show Mad Men, take a look sometime because it's a perfect example of American culture in the 1950s and early 1960s when smoking was just a part of daily life for most American adults. Now there are far more prohibitions and restrictions on nicotine use and cigarette use, and the amount of smokers has dropped significantly over the last couple of generations. I think it's fair to say that marijuana is starting to take its place as a drug that's much more widely accepted now and even being promoted. Although we're in a transitional period of states making it legal, the perceptions around marijuana use are very different than they were in previous generations, and that's why we've included it here with the celebrated drugs. So let's just take a look at some fun facts about each of these different drugs. So alcohol at the top belongs to a category called sedative hypnotics or depressants. Other drugs in this category include barbiturates and benzodiazepines such as Xanax, Valium, and Ativan. It's good to know that drinkable alcohol is called ethanol. The other types of alcohol, which are isopropanol and methanol, should never be consumed. Isopropanol is rubbing alcohol, and methanol is a very dangerous chemical solvent that's used in a variety of products. When we drink alcohol, it gets absorbed in our small intestine and eventually gets metabolized by the liver after it's traveled through our body, and it passes over the blood-brain barrier, which is where it starts to have its effects. So when we talk about somebody being intoxicated, what's happening is their brain is actually feeling the effects of the alcohol. A few different definitions to be aware of. If somebody's a non-drinker, they don't drink at all. They never touch alcohol. They don't use it even on special occasions. By definition, a social drinker is somebody who has had a drink within the last 30 days, but doesn't meet the other categories of binge drinking and heavy drinking. A binge drinker is someone who's had, if they're a female, 4 or more drinks on one occasion, or if they're male, 5 or more drinks on one occasion within the past month. So that would be the definition of a binge. 4 drinks for women, 5 drinks for men. And then a heavy drinker is somebody who's had 5 or more binge episodes within the last 30 days. So somebody who's had at least 5 times where they've consumed a binge amount of alcohol. Moving down to talk about caffeine in the middle there. Some examples that are very common would be coffee, tea, or soda, and smaller amounts are also found in chocolate. It is the most consumed drug on the planet. An average cup of coffee that you would get in the United States has about 75 to 150 milligrams. So there is a pretty significant range there, all the way double the lower amount, but it gives you some idea of how much is in 1 cup of coffee typically. Now, although caffeine use disorder does not exist in the diagnostic manual, the DSM, they do identify that tolerance and withdrawal are possible. So it is possible for your body's metabolism to get used to higher levels of caffeine and to experience withdrawal symptoms if you've used for an extensive period of time and then quit suddenly. However, there is no specific use disorder for caffeine. Moving down to the bottom with marijuana. Some people were surprised, researchers were surprised, when years ago they discovered that our brains actually have cannabinoid receptors. We also have opioid receptors, for example. So our brain can naturally produce some of the same effects that cannabis plants can. When it comes to getting high from cannabis use, What the chemical that's doing that is called THC, and the highest concentrations of THC are found in the female plants. So typically when anything's being sold, whether it's on the black market or whether it's on the legal marijuana market, those are female plants that are being harvested for their THC. For medicinal purposes, and many states now do allow cannabis to be prescribed by a physician, cannabis has been used to improve appetite, prevent convulsions in people with seizures, and even to help manage chronic pain. There's some hope that it could partly replace opioids as a way for people to deal with chronic pain conditions. All right, let's look at some of the effects of each of these drugs. So with alcohol, what it's doing is blocking GABA, which is an important neurotransmitter that's normally an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So just like benzodiazepines, which we mentioned earlier, alcohol blocks those GABA receptors. And so it literally is lowering our inhibition. So the more somebody drinks, the more their inhibition is lowered, which is why it's more likely somebody will say and do things that they normally won't. It's literally blocking your filters. So it also impairs your judgment. It slows reaction time. So if you're driving or doing something else that requires quick and precise reflexes, those are always going to be slowed. Even though it's interesting that many drivers, their perception of their driving ability when they're consuming alcohol is that they're better drivers. And the research doesn't really support this. The research shows that they're often slower to react to situations, which makes it more likely they'll get into an accident. The one possible reason that people would be driving better when they're intoxicated is that they're concerned about getting pulled over and stopped for drinking and driving. And so they may be a bit more cautious about their driving, but their judgment is still impaired and their reflexes are still slowed. Alcohol can cause significant changes in mood and behavior, especially at higher doses. Alcohol is a particularly damaging drug when it comes to internal organs. So most drugs of abuse affect one or two different organs and over time can certainly have major physical consequences. But alcohol is particularly damaging to various organs of the body. Everything from your brain and your lungs, your liver, your esophagus, your stomach are all very badly impacted by alcohol. So it's associated with many different health problems. Also, withdrawal from alcohol, if somebody's a chronic long-term user, the withdrawal can be really serious. It can include convulsions, seizures, hallucinations, and it's potentially even fatal. So if somebody's a long-time drinker, it's really important that they get medical attention and go through a medical detoxification process. Moving on to caffeine. When we're awake throughout the day, our brain produces a chemical called adenosine, and that's basically making us more and more sleepy as the day goes on. So eventually we feel the need to sleep as the adenosine builds up. Caffeine blocks that, and so it makes us feel less sleepy and at least temporarily more alert. It increases our heart rate, and it does improve attention. There's several studies linking better performance on academic exams and some other areas with caffeine use. So it can actually enhance performance a little bit because it improves attention. So it is a stimulant in that regard. For some people, it causes insomnia or the inability to sleep, as well as jitteriness or even some shakiness. Be aware that if you do consume caffeine, it typically takes 8 to 10 hours to be completely eliminated from your body. So some of the effects of a morning cup of coffee can be felt much later in the day. And if you're using caffeine in the afternoon, that's going to go all the way up into the evening hours. We talked on the last slide about tolerance and withdrawal. The FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, their recommended limit for how much you should consume in a day is 400 milligrams on the high end. And so we talked about a cup of coffee being around 100 milligrams, although several stores may sell stronger variations. Using more than 400 milligrams a day can actually lead to a withdrawal, which would include headaches and sometimes difficulty sleeping and concentrating. So just be aware of that. Finally, for cannabis or marijuana, we talked about the psychoactive component being that THC. When using it, the user's perception is shifted, so they can sense that time is different, or they're actually interacting with things can feel or sound different to them. There's quite a bit of research linking marijuana use to impaired short-term memory. So if while you're on it, you're trying to learn new information, it can be very difficult to do. And often users experience that effect even a day or two after they've stopped using. There's also some link between cannabis use and the onset of mental illness among teenagers. So particularly in that late adolescence between 16 and 20, there is a higher incidence of mental illness among that population, and that's when a lot of people will develop major mental illnesses like schizophrenia. And there's also a link between using cannabis and the onset of those mental illnesses. So the link isn't causal at this point, but there's some strong evidence to suggest that marijuana use may play a role in increasing the likelihood of developing mental illness. Let's take a look at prevalence rate and some other data around these drugs. So with alcohol, this is in the United States. For people 18 and over, so American adults, even though the drinking age is 21, in this survey for people 18 and over, 70% had a drink in the past year, at least one drink. So if you had even one drink, you're in that category. That means 30% did not have a single drink for the whole year. 55% said they'd had a drink within the past 30 days. Among 12th graders at senior year of high school, just a little over half report having used alcohol within the past year, and 14%, which is about 1 in 7, report that they've binge used. So remember, that's at least 4 drinks for women, 5 drinks for men on one occasion. So even though those numbers are concerning and we want to be aware of them, that's actually a significant decrease over the past decade. And some of that is because there's been a little bit of a shift in drug using patterns among adolescents, but alcohol use has declined somewhat. A little over 14 million American adults meet the diagnostic criteria for alcohol use disorder. Also, 88,000 people in the United States die every year from alcohol-related causes. I mentioned how damaging alcohol is to all the systems of the body. So everything from liver failure to other kinds of cancers can be attributed to alcohol use. And so a huge number of people die from those causes, as well as accidents related to alcohol use. Now, worldwide, if you were to take all the alcohol that gets consumed in a year by all the 7 billion people in the world, we average about 1 bottle of wine per week per person. So each person on Earth consumes on average a bottle of wine per week. And of course, there's going to be huge variation there, but just kind of an interesting data point. With caffeine, 85% of Americans have at least one caffeinated drink every day, coffee and tea being the big ones. So almost all American adults consume caffeine on a pretty regular basis. On average, that comes out to about 165 milligrams, which is roughly 2 cups of coffee per day. So that's pretty typical. And consumption of caffeine actually goes up as people get older, especially over age 40. People tend to consume more caffeine. When it comes to marijuana, 55 million adults, or about 22%, said that they used marijuana in the past year. 35 million of those are monthly users. So lower than alcohol, certainly, but a pretty significant number, and more than, say, they smoke cigarettes on a regular basis. For 12th graders, going back to the adolescents, the high school seniors, 36% said they'd used marijuana within the past year. So that number is a little bit lower than alcohol, which was at 52%, but not that much lower. So marijuana use is actually catching up to alcohol. And most likely that's one of the reasons that there's less alcohol use, is because the shift in patterns is shown up more with cannabis and marijuana use. If you take a look at daily users, so 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade, they're at the very bottom. So which of those groups saying they use every single day on a regular basis? With 8th graders, it's a little over 1%. Once they get to 10th grade, there's been more exposure. It's probably a little more common that your peers are using. That's up to almost 5% are daily users. And by 12th grade, that's over 6%. So let's discuss social norms just a little bit. And by social norms, I mean what's typical for the culture, what we consider acceptable and to be okay. And the very fact that we're including marijuana on this slide is a significant change in social norm in the United States, because As I mentioned before previously, certainly before 2000 or even 2010, marijuana use was considered to be a bit of a fringe drug. It certainly was happening. There certainly were a lot of people using it, but the rates were lower. It wasn't legal in any states before the roughly 2010. So it's really moved, and like I said, the perception toward its dangers and its acceptability have shifted hugely. And so that's interesting that it's even here now. So let's talk about alcohol a little bit. It's been part of cultures for thousands of years. So as far back as we have records of human cultures, there are also stories, drawings, ceremonies, everything that we can find. Cultures used alcohol going back thousands of years. It was used for religious ceremonies. It's also been used for some medicinal purposes, and now it's a common part of daily life in America. In the United States, where we have a drinking age of 21, it's actually one of the highest in the world. Many countries have a drinking age between 16 and 18 years, but the United States, which for a while had an 18 drinking age, is at 21 right now. Drinking and driving, although there's been changes, very positive changes, and more awareness about the seriousness of drinking and driving, thanks in part to groups like MAD, it's still a major problem in the United States because drinking is a social norm, like we talked about, and driving is also a social norm. So we don't use public transportation as much as most other cultures. Ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft have started to shift this discussion a little bit. But most people own cars, and most people have to drive fairly significant distances every day in the United States. And so because of that, drinking and driving is still a major problem, even though laws have gotten much stricter over time. Alcohol is also the #1 drug associated with crime. When it comes to caffeine, as you know, it's a very readily available. Use of caffeine is widely tolerated. People are rarely ever criticized for their caffeine use. If anything, there's jokes made about it. I think it's fairly safe to say it's a widely accepted and celebrated drug. And overall, the consequences of using are usually minor unless you use in enormous quantities. But people who use under that FDA recommended 400 milligram limit tend to not have very many significant problems. And those who do notice that their caffeine use has increased typically don't have a lot of trouble reducing their use and weaning themselves off if they need to. For marijuana use, like I mentioned, it is becoming more normative. So that's a major change in our social attitude. The perception is that it's less dangerous. So if you ask people in the 1980s or even the 1990s, a lot of people would have said that marijuana was a very dangerous drug. And the government has tried to really push that perception over time. It's Schedule 1, which is the most dangerous and least allowable. But I think over time, people have become more aware that cannabis isn't as dangerous as drugs like heroin or methamphetamine. And as states have legalized it, adolescents are now growing up in a culture where, again, marijuana is more celebrated and more accepted. A lot of states have moved toward recreational marijuana, and many also have medical marijuana. Despite that, the federal government still has it on Schedule 1, which means there's no acceptable medical uses. And for the federal government's purposes, marijuana is an illegal drug. And so until that changes, there's going to be some conflict and some mixed messages. It leaves unresolved issues for employers and for the police and courts. Even though states have their own laws, a lot of people in society now think, well, marijuana is legal, so I should be able to grow it. I should be able to buy it, even if it's not legally buying it. I shouldn't be in trouble for owning it. There's also controversy about whether an employer doing a drug test, if you test positive for cannabis, should that be used against you? And at this point, a lot of those decisions are still up in the air and unresolved. This information is from the NIDA Monitoring the Future survey, and they do surveys of thousands and thousands of adolescents every year to try to determine drug using patterns and attitudes and get a sense of what's going on in the country. So if you look over just the past 5 years, and this would be up until 2019, that 5-year stretch, illegal drug use among adolescents was pretty much the same. It hadn't changed significantly. The highest peak of drug use among adolescents ever since they've started doing the survey in the 1960s was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So those were the highest years, like roughly 1978 to 1983. If you look at the drug using rates, illegal drug use rates, those were the highest among adolescents during that period. And they've actually come down quite a bit. There's some fluctuation over time, but drug use now today is lower than it was at that time. Alcohol and prescription use, prescription drug use in particular, and prescription drugs like OxyContin, Vicodin, and Adderall would be some examples. Use of those is lower, nearly 50%. If you remember the previous slide about alcohol, 52% of seniors said they'd had a drink in the past year. So that means almost half of seniors are non-drinkers, and that shows a shifting pattern there. We talked about cigarettes. Cigarettes are no longer a celebrated drug. They're prohibited widely throughout society. And at this point, less than 2% of teenagers are daily cigarette smokers. At one point, this was nearly 10 times higher, closer to 20 or even 25%. But that's gone down significantly. However, that's just talking about cigarettes. One of the things that's taken their place is e-cigarettes or vapes. And over 12% of high school seniors are daily vape users. So that's made up for a lot of the shift in the way nicotine is consumed. So they're still consuming nicotine, and it's just a shift in how they're doing it now with e-cigarettes instead of with traditional cigarettes. In particular, with younger teens between the ages of 13 and 16, they're showing increased increased rates, of marijuana use. And we're taking a look at why that would be. One pretty straightforward explanation is that marijuana use has become more normative, more accepted in American society. Many states have legalized it. Access to it is probably getting easier for a lot of teens, and their perception of its dangers are much, much lower. All right, this concludes the presentation. I hope you found that interesting and give you a kind of different look at some of the more common drugs in our society by putting them together under a category called the celebrated drugs. And we appreciate you watching. Thank you.